possibility of an implementation conference for Ghana, supported by 5 African countries, by NEPAD, by the Regional Commission and by UNEP. They were looking forward to taking forward the JPOI commitments to partnership and implementation. Donors were approached, and what we saw was an early indication in 2003 and 2004 that the outcome from Johannesburg were not a high priority in the development departments of the donors. Only one was prepared to support the process. This could have generated a whole series of best practice, good knowledge sharing and an engine for implementation post-Johannesburg in Africa. Development ministries were focusing on the Millennium Development Goals implementation, and clearly there is a crossover. But they did not see the outcomes from Johannesburg as a priority, and I think that was a mistake. The idea of champions is still a good idea, and the idea of partnership is too. Rio+20 must recapture these ideas, and that means there must be active involvement of the development ministries. I want to take us to the second point, problems within the UN system. When the CSD was set up, the Secretariat was not in the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, which came into existence much later. It was in the UN Department for Policy Coordination and Sustainable Development, a much smaller department with an Under-Secretary General, Nissa Desai, who was the number 2 to Maurice Strong at Rio. Under DPCSD was the Division on Sustainable Development. Nitin said that if the CSD and DSD became the only places where sustainable development was dealt with in the UN system, then Rio would have been a failure. The UN task manager system was comprised of the relevant UN agencies and programs responsible for overseeing the different chapters of Agenda 21. This ensured the buy-in of the whole of the UN system, and by doing so, multiplied the impact out throughout the UN. To help the coordination within the UN system, the Interagency Committee on Sustainable Development was set up in 1993. The IACSD did excellent work up to the point in 1998 when it was closed down. Perhaps we need to look again at the possibility of an Interagency Committee on Sustainable Development. From 1993 to 1998, the UN had a high-level advisory board on sustainable development, advising the CSD and the UN Secretary-General and being champions for Agenda 21 around the world. The high-level board had Rio veterans such as Tommy Coe, Maurice Strong, Mustafa Tolba, Emil Salim, Stephen Smithheimy. But the board was also closed down in 1998 in the UN reforms. Perhaps the time has come to re-evaluate this and to consider whether we need a new set of champions for sustainable development. Perhaps this should include the former chairs of the UN CSD. There's been some excellent work on interagency coordination done by UN Water, UN Energy and UN Oceans. But again, I would underline that there is no overarching interagency committee on sustainable development, which could feed into the Secretary-General's Chief Executive Board. Is this good for mainstreaming sustainable development within the UN system? One of the problems faced by the CSD in the cycle since 2003 to date has been there is no space on the CSD agenda to change course. In reports produced by civil society over the last 5 years, one of the easiest recommendations that could have been picked up and implemented was that of creating a standing agenda item on institutional framework for sustainable development, each CSD, so that governments could look at whether they were going in the right direction or whether they wanted to change direction. I think that still is a very relevant part of what needs to be done. These reforms on CSD implementation need to be considered to ensure that we actually have an effective body at this level. Equally important is that there needs to be adequate funding for the glue in the process. Perhaps we need to recognise that at the moment there is a lack of money both at the intergovernmental level, at the national level and at the stakeholder level. I wanted to just remind you of one of the parts of the original mandate of the CSD. 3 of the original terms of reference of the CSD dealt with means of implementation, which was why we had a situation in the first 5 years of the UN CSD that the intersessional meetings, one of those working groups would be on sectoral issues and one would be on finance and means of implementation. And that is why the development ministries used to send high-level representation to the CSD in that first 5-year period. And I think that's a very important thing to do. We're missing some of the most important departments, and those are the ones with money. We need to re-establish national councils for sustainable development at the national level, so there is a conjugate to enable processes to be joined together with stakeholders and governments at the national level. In summary, Rio+20 should reboot sustainable development. It should re-establish effective national processes, including CSDs. It should involve new stakeholders such as regional government, foundations and parliamentarians. It should re-establish an effective interagency committee on sustainable development. It should bring together a high-level group to help guide the CSD in the future. It should focus on champions to replicate good practice. We should revisit the issue of monitoring effective means of implementation at Rio+20. Bring the relevant government ministries to the table, the ones with the money, and we should adequately fund sustainable development process at all levels, intergovernmentally, national and stakeholder. And what we need now is new thinking. As Albert Einstein said, we can't solve the problems by using the same thinking we used when we created them. Thank you very much.